It's a real pleasure for us to put this event, a panel presentation, discussion, which will focus on 6 days, 5 decades, 1967, and I'm sure many of you know that that's a reference to the Six-Day War, but primarily what was its significance and what is its significance in terms of the years that have passed since for various aspects of Israel's security, politics, and society. This event was put together and organized, co-sponsored by the UNIS and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies and the UCLA Allen Levy Center for Jewish Studies. And today, we're really fortunate to have an esteemed, panel of experts assembled, literally from all the way from Israel to the U.S. To talk to us about a variety of topics. So what I'm going to do is just briefly introduce the panel members. Then you will hear from them in the sequence in which they are seated. And after they give their presentations, there will be a Q&A. I will ask a few very difficult questions. Well, that's what happens when a professor is allowed to moderate. And then we'll open it for Q&A from the crowd. And I'll tell you at that point what are the rules for asking questions. Where the universities are, sometimes we have rules, not always. In any event, I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. Gilead Sher, and who is came to us all the way from Israel, okay, not long ago. He is an Israeli attorney, served on the chief of staff and policy coordinator. He was a policy coordinator to former Prime Minister and Minister of Defense Ehud Barak, and I could spend literally an hour just reading his bio sketch. But I can tell you that there are very few that have had direct insight into negotiations that had to do, with peace, with establishing relationship with the Palestinians and Israel neighbors. As Gilead Sher has had the opportunity, the experience to serve the state of Israel in various capacities. But he also has an extensive background in the academic world, having taught and lectured in the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, also at Tel Aviv University, where he served as an adjunct faculty, seminars in various locations, including at Harvard and Tufts, Northwestern University, University of Windsor in Canada. So you get the idea that he travels all around the world. And I was quite amazed when he briefly told me about some of the elements of having to negotiate, with sometimes you have to travel 10,000 miles just for a 2-hour meeting, which I thought was just amazing. So he has tremendous stamina. I've known Gilead for many years, and I know that you'll be very pleased to hear from him and to get the kind of information and the insight that only somebody who has been on the inside can provide. And so, again, thank you for being here and taking the time, Gilead. And sitting next to him is Moti Inbari, who is an assistant professor of religion at the University of North Carolina. And his research focuses on various aspects of Jewish fundamentalism in Israel. He earned his PhD at the Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was a Schusterman visiting assistant professor at the University of Florida, and of course wrote a number of textbooks. And I should also say I forgot to mention that Gilead Sher has also written a couple of textbooks or books on the subject of Israel negotiations for peace, but I'm sure he'll mention his experience when he makes a presentation. Then I should say Moti Inbari is here, and you'll hear from him about various aspects of how Jewish religion, fundamentalism, has actually contributed to various aspects of Israel, culture, and the political scene and other aspects of Israel, its relationship with its neighbors and the Palestinians. I should say that his book, and I have to say, Moti, I just forgot the title, that just won tremendous acclaim with regard to the issues of with regard to the issue of fundamentalism and really, oh yeah, terrific. All right. So, and the title of the book you'll see has a lot to do with what he's going to be talking about, and that's the Messianic Religious Zionism confronts Israeli territorial compromises, and it's Cambridge Press right here. And did you bring copies to sign? No. Okay. All right.
I have one copy.
One copy. Then we have Professor Eli Rekas from who's gotten his PhD at Tel Aviv University. He is really one of Israel's leading experts on the Arab minority in Israel, the Jewish-Arab relations, Palestinian politics, and Islamic resurgence in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. One of the things that is interesting is that he's taking his expertise and where he is now at Northwestern University, where he holds a position of the Crown Visiting Professor of Israel Studies and really runs much of the Center for Israel Studies at Northwestern. Again, he has written a tremendous amount regarding the Zionist ideal in Israeli culture with respect to issues that have to do with the Palestinians and the Israelis. He talked about one of the things that he's really involved with and has contributed to, which is important for those of us in LA. He has established, a major program on with the Israeli Film Festival in partnership with the Chicago Festival of Israel Cinema in 2015, right? And here, as you know, in LA, we also have the Israel Film Festival year after year, and our center is also involved and sponsors, films in that festival. So I'm not going to say much more, just to say that Professor Rekas, has also had, tremendous involvement in the political scene. He was a senior consultant on Arab minority affairs to the Prime Minister office under Yitzhak Rabin, and also consultant on various Arab affairs to the Histadrut, the labor organization in Israel. He also was an advisor to Ehud Barak as well. And, the list is just amazing. So we'll hear from Professor Eli Rekas later on and about his insights. And then last, but not least, is Professor Paul Rivlin, who is an economist and a senior research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. And he's also with the IDC in Herzliya. He studied in Cambridge, London, Harvard University. He's the author of 5 books. I'm amazed that he finds the time to write so much, but it shows you the extent of his reach in terms of dealing with dynamics of economic policy making in Egypt, Israel economy, the relationship with the Arab world. And one point that I wanted to indicate is that he's also involved, and I think in a very significant way, through the establishment of a monthly publication on the Middle East economy, which publishes in both Hebrew and English. So he's well informed with tremendous experience on the impact of the Arab nations on Israel and the Arab nations' economy, and this is an important part when we deal with Israel post-1967. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to our panel speakers, and our first one is Gilead Sher, and please welcome him, and please, Gilead.
Shalom, good evening to all of you. Yoram, thank you very much for this generous introduction. 120 years ago, the first Zionist Congress convened in Basel, Switzerland. For the first time in 2 millennia in exile, the vision of an independent political entity for the Jewish people was formulated. 20 years afterwards, in 1917, the Zionist movement achieved its most significant milestone, the Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This year marks also 70 years to UN Resolution 181, calling for the partition of the then British-ruled Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. This brings me to the 4th anniversary celebrated these very days, 50 years to the 1967 war. Has the Six-Day War ever ended? This is the question today. Attacked by 5 Arab states, which were supported by 8 additional ones, Israel swiftly conquered the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. But the admirable victory of the 19-year-old country fighting for its life has not been translated, as of yet, into serving the core values of a Jewish democratic state. Israel has reached globally outstanding achievements in almost every field: science, culture, academy, high-tech, economy, agriculture, literature, medicine, security, resilience, while absorbing millions of immigrants. However, these 50 years also saw an incremental erosion of our founders' vision, an ongoing internal struggle over Jewish and human values, and the identity of the Israeli society. With no recognized boundaries to encompass our fundamental values, Israel in 2017 portrays growing trends of inclining towards the right via extreme nationalism, messianic religiosity, and anti-liberalism. Its unrecognized boundaries host phenomena of tribalization, fragmentation, violence, racism, inequality, intolerance, and lack of solidarity. This reality is rather distant from the Zionist aspiration for an exemplary society, and the leadership turns a blind eye. So at this point in time in Israel's history, it is more critical than ever that we end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Zionism never aspired to govern another people. 50 years on, it is crucial to draw Israel's borders alongside a demilitarized Palestinian state in order to secure the democratic nation state of the Jewish people. In the broader Middle East, non-state actors such as ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas, Shiite militia lead strong trends of fundamental Islamic terrorism, fanaticism, and violence. Iran is striving to become a hegemonic regional superpower in line for military nuclear capacity while perpetrating Islamic terrorism and threatening to annihilate Israel. None of these threats should be underestimated. On the other hand, military threats on Israel's existence have diminished considerably with the collapse of regimes such as Syria, Libya, and Iraq. Peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan are holding on. Moreover, the United States and Israel have solidified a $38 billion aid package for the next decade. There are political and economic opportunities on our threshold, not just threats. I have no question whatsoever on the Jewish people's right to self-determination in its own state in Eretz Israel. Nor have I any doubt that the Palestinian people has the right to self-determination in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Despite the solid security cooperation between the forces, the Israeli and Palestinian forces, today's borders and status quo are unsustainable, militarily, diplomatically, and morally. In contrast, the 1967 borders with modifications to reflect the changes on the ground are defensible. So why not, at least at this point in time, delineate provisional boundaries along, say, the security fence, incorporating the major settlement blocks? It will clearly contribute to the national security of Israel in its broadest sense. My fellow negotiators and I spent years negotiating intensively the intertwined, complex core issues of Jerusalem, the holy sites, the refugees, territory, borders, settlements, and security. In the last 2.5 decades, I've been at the negotiation table with the Palestinians, wearing official and non-official hats, working with Prime Ministers Rabin and then later on Barak in Camp David, Taba, and other extensive rounds. Altogether, I believe that I have accumulated way over 3 years of grappling with the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations on a day-in, day-out basis. Now, following President Trump's meeting with Abbas yesterday, and on the eve of the President's Middle East visit later this month, there are long odds for a permanent status comprehensive agreement in the foreseeable future. The gaps in the historical narratives of Israelis and Palestinians are wide. The two peoples distrust each other, too far apart on the core contentious issues, and their respective leaderships are reluctant to move ahead. My current government, as well as the Palestinian leadership, do not firmly want peace and are not ready to take the risks that are involved in it. However, once the dispute is over, eventually, the package deal will be very similar to the Clinton parameters of December 2000. In order to get there, we need a proactive approach. We need an approach that would resolve the conflict throughout the territorial division of the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. I refer to a balanced and graduated political initiative with transitional phases. It is time for Israel to initiate, change the course, stop being dragged and cornered. We cannot continue being hostage to Palestinian rejectionism, terrorism, and extremism. At the same time, we need to realize that a political horizon for the Palestinians is also a roadmap for genuine Israeli independence. We must reverse the trend towards a one binational state that would be neither Jewish nor democratic. Israel must draw its borders while disengaging from the Palestinians by renewing negotiations regionally, bilaterally, and independently. In other words, with or even without a comprehensive agreement in sight. Now, if indeed the Trump administration aims at leading an international effort to facilitate Israeli-Palestinian peace, it should take into consideration lessons drawn from past experience and past failures and adopt a three-pronged approach. It goes without saying that any process should comprise bilateral negotiations. However, not as an exclusive course of action. It should simultaneously promote tracks of regional dialogue within the framework of the Arab Peace Initiative and independent constructive steps. Such steps will allow preserving the conditions for a two-state solution through a gradual creation of a two-state reality. They can take the form of political interim agreements, gradual processes with transitional phases along with a pragmatic, uncompromising approach to counter terrorism and violence. And finally, tangible traction on the ground should be simultaneously promoted, enabling a bottom-up progress to sustain any political dialogue on any of the tracks. The international community should differentiate between the main settlement blocks, Jerusalem, and the settlements in the rest of the West Bank. About 80% of the settlers reside in the main blocks of settlements, and those blocks would be eventually incorporated within the final borders of Israel under any kind of arrangement. Trump should aim for a firm commitment by the Palestinians not to internationalize the conflict by condemnation of Israel in international fora or promoting boycott campaigns and to fight incitement to violence and glorification of terrorism against Israelis and Jews. In addition to the above, President Trump is well positioned to recognize that economic development in the Palestinian territories is indispensable for shaping the region's stability. A Marshall Plan for Palestinian development, preferably led by the US, should invite the relatively moderate Sunni Arab states, the Arab Quartet, to be partners of Israelis and Palestinians. It should promote meaningful economic access for Palestinians to Area C in the West Bank, territory that makes up 60% of the West Bank, and concretize plans for the reconstruction of Gaza based on rock-solid arrangements in the security-wise and within this framework of a regional diplomatic effort. Process-wise, it is essential to change that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. This was the paradigm for the Camp David, the Taba, and the Annapolis processes, as well as the Kerry Round, into what has been agreed should be implemented. Such approach would provide the ground for an arrangement on boundaries, security, statehood, and economy. Add to that mutually coordinated independent Israeli and Palestinian steps in line with the two-state reality. Subsequently, the negotiations over Jerusalem and the refugees will continue in a state-to-state fashion, as well as within a regional framework. I will zoom in now into what Israel should imperatively do regarding the settlements and other matters in order to ensure that whatever happens, it will preserve its Jewish democratic identity. First, an Israeli statement: no long-term sovereignty claims eastwards of the security fence, hence outside the settlement blocks. Halt the settlement construction outside the main blocks. Initiate a genuine, ongoing engagement with the Israeli society, the Israeli public, in preparation of the public opinion on the critical need to take decisive action for the sake of Zionism. Promote within government a national-scale planning for the relocation of up to 100,000 people. Note that in the absence of an agreement, there will be no evacuation by force. Formulation of a national prioritization program for resettling citizens now living beyond the security fence. Pass a legislation on voluntary evacuation, compensation, relocation, and absorption. Solidify security cooperation with the Palestinians and encourage governance, institution building, Palestinian law enforcement, viable economy, improvement of Palestinian lives until an agreement is reached. With the support of the international community, initiate an Israeli effort to rehabilitate Gaza, including an international task force, allocating a special role to both Egypt and the Palestinian Authority, alleviation of the closure on the Strip against a long-term truce with Hamas, construction of port, infrastructures of water, sewage, and energy, and a joint Israeli-PA-Egyptian crossing point. Now, saving the Zionist enterprise requires courage, leadership, and national responsibility. Otherwise, Israel will face imposed arrangements, delegitimization, demonization, international isolation, and the erosion of its core values. Therefore, the two states for two people reality is indispensable. It is in the benefit of a Jewish democratic Israel and consistent with the Zionist vision. It is attainable throughout a series of transitional phases, interim arrangements, and independent steps, all compliant with a continuous negotiation process. An internal Israeli dialogue and a participatory process are also essential to amend schisms within our society. To President Trump and the international community, my message is that both Israel and the Palestinians need your hands-on and assistance. I call the Israeli leadership to be proactive, strategize, plan, and act to achieve peace and security. To the settlers, I say, mission accomplished. Regrettably, some of you will have to come back home. To the Palestinians, stop victimizing yourselves. Take responsibility. Decrease hate. Stop terrorism. Address your needs. We should all remember that we can always go back to killing each other. Now, 50 years on, let me conclude by reminding all of us that tough, bloody, protracted conflicts have come to an end. It is in our hands. Thank you.
All right. Well, you see the title of my talk on the board, and I want you to pay attention to the picture. This is one of the symbols of the disengagement from Gaza. And what we see here is just one woman trying to hold on against a battalion of police officers who are coming to evacuate her from her house. And kind of this encapsulate the issue that I want to talk about today, in which how religious Zionists cope with territorial compromises. I want to start our conversation today with this man that you see the picture up front. His name is Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Cook. And this is a good starting point for our discussion. And he was a Lithuanian rabbi, a well-known scholar. During his lifetime, he had to confront, as well as most of Orthodox Jews have to confront the question, the theological big question of how to treat the new rising Zionist movement. And Zionism was a great dilemma for Orthodox Judaism because the Zionists were implementing things that were associated with the end days. Jews' immigration to the Holy Land, land of Israel or Palestine, call it whatever you want, establishing a Jewish entity, a state, a homeland, and doing it by themselves. In the Jewish tradition, it was understood that all those things that the Zionists were implementing would take place eventually at the end of days, when the Messiah would come and he will perform miracles. So here we saw the Jews from East Europe immigrating to Palestine and establishing what God was supposed to do through miracles. And this was a great, and the Zionist movement was not religious. And to some extent, it was even anti-religious. It was secular, even anti-religious to some extent. And this was a great dilemma for Orthodoxy, how to treat it. And the mainline answer to this dilemma was that Orthodoxy opposes Zionism. Because they are secular, because they are taking God's role in the end-day scenario. But he could not, although he understood the issue, he could not oppose Zionism. And therefore, he came with a formula. in which the Zionist movement represents the first steps of the Jewish redemption. And this is a formula that we sometimes read in our liturgy, the first steps of the redemption. What does it mean? It means that God is not going to perform redemption through miracles and righteous messiahs and all that, but this is going to be a long process in which Jews, the Zionist movement, are only performing currently the first steps of this process. This process will continue forward. Okay, and this is my next slide. Yes, so this process will move forward. So the Zionist movement represents the first stages, but there are further stages to continue. And those stages will include establishing a Jewish theocracy, and building the temple. And so according to the rabbi's formula, the Zionist movement is the first step, so okay, I said it, and the seculars are promoting God's intentions without knowing God's intentions. So okay, so based on these premises, he was able to join Zionism and to be part of that movement. He actually became the first chief rabbi of the Zionist movement. Okay. So this was an argument, this was a theory, and the theory, okay, you know, you can argue for or against the theory. It was hard to prove it. The rabbi died in 1935. His son, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, took control of the religious institutions that the father has established, and his role was to implement his father's theories into political action. And the moment came after the '67 war and Jewish conquests of the West Bank and Gaza Strip and Jerusalem, and most importantly, the Temple Mount. And so all of these events kind of reinforced the theory that this is indeed a messianic process, and God's intervention and miracles were happening during the war. And this is the language in which Israelis used to describe the war. Yes, it was the hand of God, it was a miracle, God's intervention in the world, and this really gave rise to the young generation of religious Zionists who later on established the settlements. Now, Rabbi Kook, he was the spiritual father of the Gush Emunim movement. The Gush Emunim, Block of the Faithful, it was the movement that was responsible for the first settlements, and so there were two issues here. So first of all, the state of Israel conquered these big territories, yes, vast territories, but never annexed it to itself, putting it as in the context of occupied territories. Yes, it was never annexed to the state of Israel, with the exception of Jerusalem, of East Jerusalem. And the idea was that it will be part of a big compromise, as Gilead Sher has said, so based on the idea of land for peace. Yes, the formula was land for peace. Israel will return the lands, and then in return will get peace. And this young man, under the leadership of Rabbi Kook, really wanted to prevent it from happening, because God gave us land. You know, we won the war. It was God's intervention. It was God's. This is the part of a messianic process. So we can certainly not allow it to be returned. So now, the theology of this movement is built on two concepts. So first of all, the land of Israel is holy. Well, this is easy to explain. Why do the land of Israel holy? Because it's written in the Bible. Yes, it's very clear. The land is holy. So what does it mean? It means the soil. It means really the piece of land is holy. Everything is holy. But they added another twist to the story. They had another sanctification, which is that the state of Israel is holy. Why the state of Israel is holy? Because God chose the state of Israel to bring the redemption of the Jewish people. In their eyes, the state of Israel was no longer at the beginning of redemption, it was already in the middle of the process. Now, this formula works great when the state expands itself into the territories that are considered to be the holy territories of the Bible, Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, Samaria, Hebron, and all that. This works very well. But the state of Israel not necessarily prescribe to the formulas that the religious Zionists came up with. And the state of Israel, in 2 occasions, signed up peace treatments, peace agreements with Egypt and with the PLO that contained territorial compromises. And this brought into a conflict among religious Zionists because both the land and the state are considered holy. So the religious Zionists are loyal both to the land and to the state. But what happens when the states decide to retreat from territories? So these are the questions, yes? How can a state that uproots settlements and hands over parts of the biblical land of Israel to Arab rule considered absolute sacred? What sublime religious meaning can be attributed to the actions of a secular state which threatens to destroy by its own hands the chance of realizing messianic hope? Was viewing the Jewish state as a fulfillment of the divine will, was it a mistake? Okay, so now, when we establish those questions, I need to mention a few theories in psychology, which are relevant to our conversation. And the theory that I use in my book is the one of cognitive dissonance. And this is a theory that was established in 1956 by a very interesting research that was conducted on people in Montana that were expecting the invasion of aliens. And when the aliens failed to invade, those psychologists tried to see how they responded to this failure of prophecy. Yeah? And what the group, so you would think that if the aliens did not eventually invade us, so it probably was a mistake, yes? But according to those who were really expecting the invasion of aliens, this is not what happened. So they actually continued believing it. So what we have seen in this research was that beliefs that are clearly falsified will be held even more intensively after falsification, and the group will increase active proselytizing. Yes. Okay. So this is cognitive dissonance. Yes. From one hand, you expect alien invasions. From the other hand, it doesn't happen. This creates tension. Yes. And the way to resolve this tension is by not admitting failure. On the contrary. Okay. So over the years, much more research has been done. By the way, cognitive dissonance theory was studied in 1,000 clinical theories and was proven correct. So it is a very significant piece of research. And so what happens when prophecy fails? Now we can say that one aspect will be that there will be proselytizing. There will be intensive proselytizing. Another aspect will be the rationalizing, excuses, yes? Rationalizations, that maybe God is testing us, maybe someone, you blame someone for failing prophecy, or there are all kinds of rationalizations, and there are actions that are conducted to reaffirm faith. And we put it in the context of the settlers. So I'll read it from the board. I argue that Messianic religious Zionist response to the failure of faith due to territorial compromise may follow one of these paths. Admit that a religious mistake has been made and retreat from Messianism. Alternatively, followers may argue that Messianic realization is indeed taking place, but in the unseen sphere. Or thirdly, finally, acknowledge the failure of the original Messianic prophecy and yet be strengthened in zeal in order to prevent its faith collapse. And now, let's give examples. So, the first option, retreat from Messianism. This is a very interesting case. Rabbi Yehuda Amital, after the Oslo Accords, came out in public and said, listen, if the Oslo Accords contain territorial compromises between the state and the PLO, then it cannot be part of a messianic process. We were mistaken. And therefore, he decided to support the Oslo Accords, and eventually after Rabin's assassination, he even joined Peres' government. So this is one option, to say, okay, I was mistaken, I'm joining the peace. Another option, Rabbi Shmuel Tal. Rabbi Shmuel Tal was in his community, were in Gaza Strip during the disengagement, and he was so bitter and he was so disappointed with the disengagement from Gaza that he decided to quit Zionism, basically. Dominion has become apostasy. Tal and his students decided to transform into the Haredi world and to become non-Zionist. Basically, okay, if this is what the state is doing for us, then we are not Zionist anymore, yes? We're joining the ultra-Orthodox world. Another approach, and this is the majority of the settlers follow this approach, and I will explain later why. How did I came with that? So this is the statist approach, meaning, here the conflict is that how can you sanctify the state and the land together? And the answer that they gave is that one answer, Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, which is a very important rabbi in these circles, is that God is testing us. This is rationalizations. God is putting us into tests in order to see if we are strong enough. So, and I've seen letters, people wrote him letters and so on. What will we do with our property? Should we build a new room? Will we get compensated? All those things. He said, yes, God is testing you. So you have to remain loyal to the land and not fear, because this is your way to show commitment. And later on, he came up with a call, and it's a big movement of settling in the hearts. Basically, it's an outreach, proselytizing movement to reach out to secular Israelis and to tell them, listen, we should not give up territories because this is our homeland. And so basically, this is outreach and proselytization that this was a response. It was really a massive movement. It was called Settling in the Hearts. His colleague, Rabbi Tzvi Tau, is a very important rabbi in those circles, came up with this answer, which is that in a natural process of redemption, there can be ups and downs. So now we are facing a down. Why? Because we didn't teach the public enough. So the solution is that the settlers should do outreach, massive outreach into the secular Israelis to explain why territorial compromises are bad and the meaning for redemption in those territorial compromises. So basically the statist approach, the one that sanctifies the state, argued that the messianic process is not failing, it's moving on, it's moving forward, it's moving in heaven, not on earth, and the way to solve the problem is through outreach. And now this is the third response, which is the post-statist and post-Zionist forcing the end, and this is the radical response. So basically the speakers of this line have said, okay, we have seen what Zionism, what the state of Israel can lead us to, and it's not, we kind of like maximized what we can reach from that state. We will not see from a secular state any type of redemption. It's not going to happen, and therefore we need to take control. We need to take control. Now, how would you take control? The Jewish leadership movement said, okay, we should go into politics. We should run into politics. We should, Moshe Feiglin, with the man that you see here in the picture, I will run. He said, I would run to be the prime minister. People will vote for me. And after people will vote for me, I'm going to change things around. Sure, no problem. I will change things around. So basically, the way in which he wanted to implement this transformation of the state of Israel into a theocracy, into a religious state, would be through the political process. His counter over there, Rabbi Yitzhak Ginsburg, came up with a different solution. He said, basically, I have no trust in the state of Israel. Therefore, I need to withdraw from the state, build an enclave, and after I'll be strong enough, I'll come and I'll conquer it down, yes? So this is basically the more revolutionary, non-political, radical response to the dilemma. Basically, there is no, the state of Israel is a dead end. We need to get rid of it through violence in order to fulfill our goals of redemption. Now, all these ideas came into what's the word I want to use? All these ideas were tested during the disengagement. The disengagement from Gaza, where Israel retreated from all of its settlements from the Gaza Strip in 2005. And what we have seen is that the religious Zionist public as a whole did not go into the radical responses. There was no civil war. There was a threat that there might be a civil war as a result of the disengagement, but it was not materialized. And therefore, we can assume that the statist approach, the one that speaks about outreach, is the most prevailing among those circles. Having said that, a new phenomenon after the disengagement took place, it's called the tag price. The tag price. What is the tag price? It's basically, if the state of Israel is doing something that annoys the settlers, they go and take a revenge on the Arabs. This is basically what's the tag price. So what we can see from that is that the more radical movement among the circles is, as a result of the disengagement, has become more, gaining more support to the extent that they are starting to use terrorism in more of like a day-to-day, more prevailing. Okay, give me one. Okay, give me one. Okay, 1 minute. So, oops. Okay. All right, so this is my last slide. And I'm going to let historian Gershon Sholem speak for me. Yes? Gershon Sholem is a very famous historian of Jewish mysticism. And this is what he said in 1972. The messianic idea is not only consolidation and hope. Every attempt to realize it tears open the abysses which lead, I apologize for my English, which leads each of its manifestation ad absurdum. There is something grand about living in hope, but at the same time, there is something profoundly unreal about it. The lessons serve as a warning to Zionism. Thank you.
As you could have seen in the last couple of minutes, there is some tension regarding the time that each speaker is allotted to. Now, you might have noticed that the chairman didn't indicate how long each speaker is going to speak. But don't be misled. It has been negotiated last night. And in fact, as of last night, I'm petrified. Because, I was invited to give a lecture, and a lecture is a lecture, not constrained by 20 minutes. So, at night, at 5 a.m., I said to myself, if I were to be told that my time is over at this very moment, and that I need to encapsulate the outcome of the Six-Day War in one sentence, I would say the following. The Six-Day War resulted in a profound, overwhelming identity crisis. 1967 represents the most serious watershed, sea change in the contemporary history of the modern state of Israel. As of 5 a.m., June 5th, unseemingly so, Israel is thrown into what would become a chaotic, divisive, disruptive debate on who are we and what do we want to be. When we were kids, we used to say, what do we want to be when we will grow up? Yeah. I'll focus on identity. An integral part to this debate, an integral party to this debate, was and still is the Arab minority in Israel, and this is my focus, the focus of my talk. I'm first going to talk on the impact of the Six-Day War on the Arabs in Israel in the immediate post-war period, and then present a historical perspective, I'm a student of history, examining how these ramifications were reflected henceforward to the present day. So, let's begin. There are 1.8 million Arabs and Druze in present-day Israel, constituting 21% of Israel's population. However, in 1948, and now allow me to begin a page and a half back to 1948, there were 150,000 Arabs who stayed in Israel, but they remained emotionally, nationally, politically, religiously, culturally bound to the outside Arab world. And this necessarily creates a sharp crisis of national identity due to split loyalties. The Arabs who remained in Israel become torn between at least four foci of national religio belongings: Israel, the Arab world, the Palestinian nation, and their religious affiliation, be it Muslim, Christian, or Druze. In the period between 1948 and 1967, the Arab component in the national identity of the Arab population in Israel was relatively subdued, I would say even dormant. Why? For the following reasons. First of all, it's the trauma of 1948, of the loss of Palestine. I'll get back to that in a couple of pages' time. Number two, the imposition of military government regime on the Arab population that lasted from 48 to 1966. Three, the physical isolation, detachment of the Arab community in Israel from the rest of the Arab world. 4 or 5, I lost count. The attitude of the Arab world, they didn't want to hear, the Arab states didn't want to hear about the Arab minority in Israel. They were considered traitors. And one additional factor, the low profile of the Palestinian problem, both in the inter-Arab arena and the international arena. Israel, on its part, adopts a dual policy, underlined by two contradictory, almost diametrically opposed considerations. One, reflecting the Jewishness of the state, which was security-oriented. The second draws upon liberal and democratic principles aimed at integration. I will not detail, there's a lot to be said about it, but I'm getting to 1967, Mr. Chairman. The latter policy of the more liberal democratic one leads Israel to embark on an integrative process which came to be known as Israelization. Now, I apologize, there are going to be a lot of zations coming up. You know, academics love this ending of Z-A-T-I-O-N. It makes them feel important and substantive in their contribution to knowledge. So, Israelization, number one. 67 war. 67 war, as I hinted before, changes the scene dramatically. It launches a process which came to be known as Palestinization. I very humbly so had the dubious honor of being part of a team that coined this term in the 70s. So what happened? The Israeli Arabs are unified with their Palestinian brethren, from whom they were physically detached for 19 years, 48 to 67. This leads to the reconstruction and revivification of their Palestinian consciousness and a solidification of the Palestinian component in the national identity. Several factors stand behind this process. The ascendancy or the ascendance of the PLO and the re-emergence of the Palestinian problem on the international scene. The National Palestinian Movement under Arafat now engages in an armed struggle in the territories, in Israel proper, and on the international arena. Israeli Arabs join in. This is a fact not oftentimes mentioned. Several hundreds of Arab Israelis joined Palestinian organization between 67 and 73. However, this trend is short-lived. The more significant impact of the war is felt on the political and ideological level and arenas. Namely, growing support for the PLO demands for self-determination for the Palestinian people, acceptance of the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinian people, including the Arabs in Israel. Additional developments in the 70s further nurture this process. Number one, the 1973 war and its horrendous outcome for Israel. The Arabs in Israel were seeing the impact of the war, the casualties, the big losses, more in a closer way than any other Arab community in the region. Number two, the 1974 Rabat Summit. Some of you may recall these. These are, I feel like I'm really dealing with history, but this was only, 40 years ago. Recognizes the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. PLO is being granted a UN observer status in 1975. This all helps to build up the Palestinian component. Now, the delicate balance between the national and the Israeli components of the identity in the 1950s and 1960s is now disrupted. Israeli-Palestinians begin to support the PLO more openly. The demand for self-determination surges. The ICP, the Israeli Communist Party, particularly popular with the Arabs in Israel, becomes a standard bearer of the Palestinization process. Its platform calls upon Israel to withdraw, recognize the PLO, and establish a Palestinian state along the state of Israel, I should add here. The outcome was obvious. 1977 general elections, which indicated a turnabout in Israeli politics, not only between left and right with the rise of the Likud to power, but also within the Arab sector. ICP, the Israeli Communist Party, wins 50% of the Arab vote, an achievement that was not, no other political party has managed to gain since then. Now, Palestinization, how am I doing? I'm good. I'm on page 9, Mr.
I'm watching.
Palestinization was not a mutually exclusive process in the sense that it categorically outweighed or eliminated Israelization. It was not a zero-sum game. On the contrary, parallel to the reformulation of national identities and political affiliations, the Arab minority undergoes an intensive process of socioeconomic change, modernization, westernization, partly due to the termination and removal of the military government. The economic progress of the Arabs in Israel leads to a substantial rise in living standards, but there is a big but here. It is accompanied by a parallel rise in the level of expectations, especially among the younger generation brought up and educated in Israel. The Arab sectors adopts as its almost exclusive yardstick for evaluating its situation, not the refugee camps of Shati in Gaza Strip or Ein Hilwe in Lebanon, as many Israeli officials used to say. What do you complain about? Look at your lot. Look, you got running water, you got electricity, and so forth. No. The only exclusive yardstick for evaluation of its situation of the Arab sector is the level of development of the neighboring Jewish population. And comparisons, of course, reveal sizable gaps in almost every socioeconomic level. Increasing socioeconomic stress, coupled with the strengthening of the national component, profoundly modify the Israeli-Palestinian Arab political behavior. What we witness in the 70s is vigorous activism, which replaces a more passive, quietist approach characteristic of the 50s and 60s. Land Day, the first Land Day of March 30th, 1976, is the best example to this trend. I'm moving fast forward. The first Intifada of December 1987 gives an added impetus to these trends. Arabs in Israel share with the people of the West Bank and Gaza the pride over the very outbreak of the uprising, pain over the killed and the wounded, and fury at Israel's iron fist policy and in the great upsurge of national sentiment. However, we should emphasize that the Intifada, the first Intifada, did not spill over into what we call the Green Line, the pre-67 borders. I now reach another turning point, and we are at the early 90s, the peace process that Gilead has spoken about. Peace process of the 1990s will have, again, far-reaching impact on the political and ideological orientation of the Arab-Palestinian community in Israel. Further accelerates the impact of 67 on the question of identity, but in a totally different context. What happened? Israel recognizes the PLO, a Palestinian authority is being established, and in this respect, the external dimension of the political platform of the Arabs in Israel is fulfilled. That external element that has been so much highlighted since 1967. We should remember that Israeli Arabs were absent from Oslo, not only physically, but also in the agreements. There was no reference to the Arab minority in Israel. And gradually, we begin to see intellectuals and political elites realize that a future Palestinian state would not necessarily fulfill the national aspirations of the Palestinian Arabs in Israel. In other words, what we see is an acknowledgement that the solution to their particular situation does not lie outside Israel, as some generous Israelis would have wanted, but rather inside. So we witness that national resources of the Arab population are now directed inward to the re-examination of the Palestinians' Arab status within Israel. This transition heralds a new orientation named the reopening of the 1948 file. What we see here is going back and re-examining the paradigm of 1948 of relations between Jews and Arabs. What does it entail? Number one, reconceptualization, another zation for you, of the status of minority. No more a fragmented group of individuals representing sectarian minorities divided along religious ethnic lines, symbolizing disunity between Muslims, Christians, Bedouins, Druze, Ahmadis, what have you. No. Now, say, me'ata emor, a national minority, akaliya qawmiya in Arabic, with distinct collective rights. A central pillar in this newly formed self-definition is reference to the Palestinian Arabs in Israel as an indigenous minority or a homeland minority existing within colonial entities. Second issue, I'm about to start concluding, Mr. Chairman, in a couple of pages' time. But don't be impressed when an academic tells you he's about to conclude, far away. Nakba. Yes, since the 1990s, we witness a trend to restore the collective historical memory of the Nakba, what is being referred to by the Arab population as the colossal loss of Palestine in 1948. A demand now comes for a complete symmetry in the national narrative, in the national memory of the Jews and the Palestinian Arabs. Nakba Day begins to be commemorated annually in public rallies and gatherings. And just the other day, 2 days ago, there was a huge such rally near Kibbutz Kabri, which was built on the land of the Arab village Kabri. Third issue, perhaps the most important one, revisiting the Jewish and democratic model. Raising the point that there is an inherent contradiction, built-in contradiction from an Arab perspective between the nature of Israel as a Jewish state and its definition as a liberal democracy. And remember my starting point. I speak about identity. How can we, as Arabs, identify with Jewish symbols of the State of Israel, such as the flag, the national anthem, and the ethnocentric worldview of the state? This incompatibility between Israel's Jewish and democratic nature on the desired nature of the State of Israel can be resolved, so say Arab academics, by either setting up a state for all its citizens, autonomy, and most popularly so, a binational state. I'm going one step further. Yes. One step further, and we are at 2006, 2007, the publication of a set of documents came to be known as the Future Vision documents. Again, new motives, endorsement of the official Palestinian narrative, rejection of the Jewish nature of the state, etc., etc. I look at your face, which become gloomier and gloomier, and therefore I'll stop here. Not my lecture, but the list of points. One important point, Israelization. Let's go back to Israelization for a moment. Here what we see is something very interesting. On the one hand, the Arab sector has been experiencing growing socioeconomic development. For the first one can identify and assume that my colleague Paul will speak about that, so I will not waste time. We can identify the emergence of a middle class that is increasingly integrated and entrenched into the fabric of societal life in Israel. It can attribute it to a variety of topics, which reasons that I will not go into. However, on the other hand, it's always at this point that I recall General Dayan, Yoam. May I take an extra minute for saying an anecdote about him? Yeah, oh, I'm good. So Dayan, General Dayan, Six-Day War, was not overly known for being sympathetic of academicians. He was a farmer, as you may recall. And it is attributed to him that he said, and this is something that is being said about lawyers and many other things, that if he's bound to meet with academicians, he wants them, no offense, amputated. Why? Again, no offense. Why? Because this way he will avoid hearing every second moment on the one hand and on the other hand. On the one, so I'm in the same position. Okay, let me conclude. Of course, I didn't finish all that I wanted to say, but it's okay. No doubt, my dear friends, that just as 1967 had shaken and had even traumatized the Jewish majority in Israel, it did so very, very powerfully so with regard to the Arab minority in Israel. The Palestinian Arab public is exposed to a combined result of three processes, one of which I haven't spoken, namely Israelization, Palestinization, and Islamization. And it is difficult to detach the impact of one from the other. They are all intertwined cohesively and nourish each other. There are lights and shadows, but one thing is clear. If and when Israel reaches an agreement with the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, whatever, it will still have to handle the challenge of being Jewish and democratic with a sizable Arab Palestinian minority in its midst. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm going to talk briefly about what actually happened in 1967 in June, a few words about that, and then I'm going to list 8 effects of the war, and then I'm going to talk about the long-term implications of some of those points. So, prior to the 67 war, the Israeli economy was in recession, and it was the deepest recession that Israel experienced since it was created in 1948. And this left people wondering about the future of the country. You know, whenever things don't look good, both here and in Israel, people wonder what on earth is going to happen. And there was anxiety on the economic front. And then the crisis broke out with Egypt. I won't go into the details. And the Israeli army begins to call up reservists. And the whole country goes into an agonizing waiting phase. Will there be a war? What will happen if there's a war? Or won't there be a war? And I remember as a child in England, my parents talking about, in very guarded terms, is it going to happen again? The it, of course, being the Holocaust. I don't know, because I wasn't in Israel at that time, whether this was in the back of people's minds, but this is something that we have to think about when we look at the change in the national psyche that came from this war. And then, in 6 days, Israel changed everything. Now, it did this with at least two factors at work. The first was, we can describe it as military prowess in the extreme, but there are two elements to it, in my eyes, as an economist. The first was the organizational power of the Israeli army, which is not something, in my experience, that is a permanent feature of armies. There are moments when armies are organized, ready, and effective, and there are moments when they are not. And this was one of those moments, if we can describe it, when the Israeli army was effective, superly effective. But the other thing that Israel had that was very significant was that it had developed certain weapons that it was able to use in conjunction with equipment that it bought from France. And the world knew that the equipment had been bought from France, and France was now boycotting Israel and no longer supplying it. But Israel had added to the French platforms certain techniques, certain technologies of its own. And I think this was of great significance, militarily, politically, and economically. So what happens when the war ends? Confidence in the Israeli economy goes from being negative to being positive, and that is really an understatement. And this is followed by a boom in investment, and in 1968, the Israeli economy grew by 14%. And that's a warning for you. I'm afraid I'm an economist, and there'll be a few figures on the way. It also resulted not just in economic growth, but in much higher defense costs and a big expansion of Israel's military industries. These industries preceded the state in their history, in their origins. And they had been developed along with the import of weapons from France, but France turned off the weapons supply, and Israel attempted, at least in part, to make good what was missing, until the United States took an interest in Israel because of its transformation into a regional power and started to supply American equipment, which is another consequence of the war, which had enormous political and economic implications. Because by linking the American economy and the Israeli economy in this way, the route was open for a very productive relationship in technology, in manpower, and all that follows. And I'm sure you've all read Startup Nation. It was also followed by the immigration, the arrival of 100,000 immigrants from the West and from the Soviet Union. Because this was a period of détente, which Scoop Jackson had forced onto an unwilling Henry Kissinger. And the arrival of these Western immigrants who were self-financed, who did not have to be financed by the Israeli taxpayer, who had very high levels of education, what economists call human capital, had networks. We use that term now in connection with the internet, but in fact knowing people, even if you have to write a letter or maybe make a phone call, which wasn't easy in Israel in those days, is of immense economic significance over time. Israel conquered the Sinai, which contained oil fields, which supplied it with over half of its oil requirements until those oil fields were returned to Egypt after the 1973 war. The war was followed by a period in which people felt relatively safe in Israel. And this made it possible for social unrest to break out in Israeli cities. And this was Jews and Jews. This wasn't the tension between Jews and Arabs that we've just heard about. This was, I'm referring to the tension between the underprivileged Jews whose parents had come from the Middle East vis-a-vis the Ashkenazi labor establishment that ruled Israel from before the state was created until at least until 1977. In response to this social unrest and against the background of higher defense expenditure, the government of Golda Meir increased social spending in order to improve the housing, and welfare and education of those groups of the society that felt alienated and were underprivileged, no question. All this resulted in much higher budget deficits, in faster inflation, problems that were pushed aside because the economy was growing so fast. And as Harry Truman said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But you can only go along so far with that approach. Last but not least in my list is the most important of all, and that's been a big theme today. Israel took over the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, and the Golan. It took on responsibility for 600,000 Palestinians in the West Bank and nearly 400,000 in Gaza, a total of almost 1 million people that Israel was going to manage the affairs of and rule over. It became the main market for their exports and labor services and the main source directly and indirectly of their imports. Until the Oslo Accords, or I should really be strict and say the Paris Accords that accompanied the Oslo Accords, Israel had complete control of the economy of this population of 1 million people. Now, what are the implications of all this? In 1967, Israel had a population of 2.8 million. It was a tiny, threatened country. The war transformed it overnight into a regional power with widely perceived technological and organizational prowess. I think, as I've hinted, the organizational prowess can be overestimated. In the military sphere in all countries, it goes up and it goes down, and that's a subject that we'll just have to leave. Apart from the political consequences of this transformation, and here I note the rise of Jewish messianism, which we've heard about today, there were important economic consequences. Confidence is a key factor in investment, and this is what the war resulted in. Between 1967 and 2015, the Israeli national income increased 12-fold, from 33 billion to $380 billion in constant prices. That's real growth. The population tripled to 8.5 million, and so the national income per head rose from $1,200 to almost $35,000, a 29-fold increase. This growth permitted living standards to increase. And for those of us who spend too much time doing economic history, it's amazing that Israel was able to join the OECD, the Club of the Rich, in 2010. Defense costs rose after the Six-Day War, which Israel unambiguously won, and after the Yom Kippur War, which Israel ambiguously won. They were so high, and against a background of slower growth, they threatened the state of the economy and had to be cut. Military service was increased after the Six-Day War because the territories that had been taken needed to be guarded and monitored, and there was a war of attrition on the Suez Canal. And just to prove that I'm an economics professor, I'm very sorry, but here we have some graphs to prove what I've been saying. This is the spending on defense in constant prices, okay, and you can see how it rises really after the 1967 war. How come you have wars that you win and then you have to spend more? 1973 is more logical. You know, it was an ambiguous victory and a very costly victory, unlike the 67 war, so the defense budget. And it remained high for some years, and it remained after the cuts at a much higher level than it did before. But it's not quite so bad. I'm going to get the next picture. Yeah. It goes up high and down, because here we've plotted the defense spending against the national income, and the national income, the share of defense comes down continuously from 1975 right down to today. And I have to tell you, I'm one of those who say it's still too high, and the reason it's so high still today is because of the continued political conflict, sometimes in a military form, that we have. Okay, let's just go back a moment and emphasize that this was a period in which Israel's military industries were expanded, and that was one of the factors leading to the creation of what we called in those days technology. When I went to live in Israel in 1980s, people were talking about these new industries, and they call them technology industries. And we had to wait until we invented the term high-tech. But a big boost in technology industries occurred as a result, in part, of the investment in the military industries at this time. And this was a form of government intervention. For those, and most economists are like that, you know, who favor free markets and don't like government, this was an interesting example of government intervention that was in many ways successful. But it overreached itself with an attempt to create a fighter plane, the Aviv, which had to be scrapped, but it yielded many benefits on the way. Perhaps the less economic point is maybe the most important. This was a period in which Israel's society begins to seemingly unravel, in which the disaffiliated children of immigrants from the eastern countries begin to rebel against the establishment, which was the labor establishment made up largely of European Jews. Now, it's not that everything happened at once. There are many, many seeds of this before the 67 war, but the improved security situation means that the tensions were manifest more openly and created a precedent, I think, for what we see today. And that is the very open display in Israeli society of polarization. And I'm aware that in the United States, debates about political issues have also become much more polarized. And if I think about the country that I occasionally visit, called England, I know that within my own family there are people who now don't speak to each other because of Brexit. So it's maybe Israel is joining other countries in this extreme form of political debate, which we can in part put down to the consequences of 1967. Another consequence of 1967 and the emphasis on high defense spending and on social spending was a worsening of the economic situation after 1973. Things take place in economics with big lags. When the 73 war came on, it brought economic growth to a halt, and Israel faced massive problems of budget deficits, balance of payments deficits, debt problems, and also inflation. Now, one of the factors that contributed to all this budgetary pressure, of course, was the construction of settlements in Sinai, in Gaza, and in the West Bank. But the change in the politics placed greater emphasis on the construction of settlements in the West Bank. In 1972, there were 1,500 Jews living in all the territories taken in 1967. By 1983, there were 24,000, and in 2015, excluding the annexed parts of Jerusalem, there were 385,000. And I just want to show a slide that I found interesting on the population of Jerusalem. The definition of Jerusalem, of course, changed in 1967 when Israel annexed the eastern part of the city and expanded the borders. And the effect of this, of course, was to bring into the Israeli city of Jerusalem, as it was now called, a significant Arab population. And you can see here how this works. All of a sudden, 1967, from being 1% of the population, 26% of the population are Arabs, and it gradually, with ups and downs, but it gradually increases to 36% on the most recent figure that I have, and that's Jerusalem. Let me now emphasize, apologies for it coming out in black, but let me just explain what's going on here. Here I've tried to be really audacious and present things in the sharpest form that I can. This is the population of Jews and Arabs, the Israeli and Palestinian population in 1967 and in 2017. The 2017 is my estimate based on 2016 figures extrapolated. Okay, now in 67 there were 2.8 million Israelis and 1 million Palestinians. We talked about them before. There were 2.4 million Jews and 1.4 million Arabs, the group that Ellie was talking about. Okay, and you've got the percentages. What do we have today? We have 8.7 million Israelis and 4.7 million Palestinians. We have 6.9 million Jews and 6.5 million Arabs. Now that figure, like the figure for 1967, includes the Arabs who are citizens of Israel and live within the green line. It includes the Arabs of Jerusalem who have, if I understand it correctly, who have Israeli identification papers, but not necessarily passports and citizenship. And it includes, much more significantly, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Okay? And you can make what you like of those figures. And those are figures that are hotly debated and hotly discussed in many circles in Israel and abroad. But I am bringing them to you because they are the consequence of the 1967 war. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
What I thought we're going to do, I'm going to ask 3 quick questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So I wanted to ask first, thank you all for really illuminating a series of talks, full of facts and projections. And the first question is to Gilad. You spoke about the issues of concern, perhaps what are the things that can be done in the future, what the U.S. can do alongside of Israel. But you didn't touch upon the following, and I wonder if you can comment on, we hear about the one-state versus the two-state solution, and I wonder if you can comment on the practicality of the two-state solution when today, when we look at Gaza and the West Bank, we see that they're really controlled by 2 different factions. And this has become a little bit more clear, or maybe more muddier today, or a few days ago, after the Abbas visit to the U.S. and then the issuance of the Hamas recent document of principles, or however it's called. So what is your view of the issues that are involved here and the complexity that may be involved as one moves towards the future, and who is going to rule those areas?
Thank you. Well, to me, it's very clear. The one-state solution, or all kinds of other schemes that are presented to the Israeli public and elsewhere, is not compliant with anything that we hoped for, that the founders of the country hoped for, and that we actually fought for, which is a Jewish democratic Israel. So there's only one way to move forward. This is disengaging from the Palestinians into a 2-state, first reality and then solution. PLO being from the outset of the political process with the Palestinians, the recognized and official representative of the Palestinian people. It is with the PLO that we have signed all the agreements since the first declaration of principles in Oslo, 1993, and then the interim agreement, 1995. And the deriving Y plantation agreement, the Hebron agreement, and the Sharm el-Sheikh agreement, which I had the privilege to be the chief negotiator on in 1999. So the complexity, of course, is existent, and many in Israel speak about the 3-state solution: the Gaza state, the West Bank state, and of course Israel. But for us, the agreement will be and should be, and rightly so, be the agreement with the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian Authority. Those who speak about confederation and all kinds of other schemes cannot bypass the delineation of a border between Israelis and Palestinians, between one entity and the other. Before we get to a confederation, before we get to any kind of other kind of attractive solutions, we have to pass through this challenge of disengaging Palestinians and Israelis into 2 nation states within this space between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So despite all the developments within the Palestinian Authority and within those 2 separate parts of the Palestinian territory, it's still the principle is that for us is that the Gaza Strip and the West Bank should form a single territorial unit in terms of sovereignty of the Palestinians once they get sovereignty over their territory.
Obviously, it's going to be quite a difficult task. The next question is really a combined question, and any one of our panel members can address that. We've heard about the impact of 67 on the Israeli Arab minority, the Israeli Arab population, and I wonder, within this context, we haven't heard about was there any impact, or is there any impact on other minority groups in Israel, such as the Christian minority, for example, the Druze in Israel. And let's take that a little bit further. I know we can spend probably a whole day debating the connection with East Jerusalem, that is really a place that is being held, as a holy site for Christianity, for the Muslims, for the Jews. And in that context, when you look at Temple, Mount, and you look at East Jerusalem, are those really just an ideological differences in that case, or is it just more symbolic of a much deeper rooted complexity that we have to face?
Actually, I have very little to say about the Christians and Druze, because the war hasn't affected them directly so, right as of 1967. It does relate to an issue that I have not expanded on, and this is the rise of political Islam, but this is not what you asked me directly. Maybe I'll have a chance to relate to that later, so I'll pass.
Saying very quickly, you mentioned political Islam, so it has a lot to do with the Temple Mount. Yes, so Israel captured the Temple Mount in 1967. It opened the possibility that Jews will build a third temple. The possibility exists. And although there's no indication that we plan to do anything of that sort at this point, but the possibility exists, and it opens up a lot of speculations among several religious communities. Among them, the one that I just spoke about earlier. Another is American fundamentalists, which has also a lot of expectations in that regard. And this has terrified another religious community, which is the Muslims. And so the Temple Mount is a hot debate, a hot place. And the Al-Aqsa Intifada, it's on the name of the Temple Mount in Arabic, Al-Aqsa. The Palestinian riots were associated with the Temple Mount, and messianic expectations are associated with the Temple Mount, and Christian messianism is associated with the Temple Mount. So this is a serious issue.
Let me give you a couple of important points regarding Jerusalem. Jerusalem has always been the sticking point for the negotiations, not the refugees or the right of return or the territorial division of the area, but Jerusalem. But speaking about Jerusalem is not the right way to speak about this sticking point, because Jerusalem, urban-wise, is divisible. I mean, what's Jewish, the 12 neighborhoods that we built since 1967 around and in and around Jerusalem are going to be Israelis, are going to be part of Yerushalayim once there is an agreement. They won't be part of any kind of a Palestinian state. And the Arab parts of Jerusalem will be part of Al-Quds, of the Jerusalem capital of Palestine. So this is doable. We need, of course, to invest in overflies and tunnels and whatever in order to have contiguity in movement and contiguity in territory, etc., wherever there is a conflict of in passages and crossing points, etc. But this is doable. So what are we talking about? We talk about the old city. The old city, this is the problem in Jerusalem. We Jews, during our 2,000 years of exile, did not pray to get back to Isawiyeh or Jabal Mukabber or the refugee camp of Shuafat. We only focused on the Western Wall, and of course the Temple Mount. So the old city, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this problem, is just a third of a square mile. That's what we are talking about. And within the old city, we speak about, for Christians, the Holy Sepulchre, for Jews, Temple Mount, and for the Arabs, the Muslims, we speak about the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third in priority for them after Mecca and Medina in terms of sanctity. And in that respect, the status quo should be kept, meaning that for us, what has been the arrangements in those areas within the old city, I think should stay. And the old city should come out. It shouldn't be divided between, 2.5 quarters for the Palestinians and 1.5 quarter for Israel that was proposed in Camp David, but rather come under a special regime that would be neither Israeli nor Palestinians. They, of course, will have a stake in it, but a special regime that has a governance system and a legal system and a special police that governs this place and allows for freedom of worship, freedom of movement of any believer in the world.